Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. We're just going to be waiting a couple more minutes to let others get on. So bear with us for a moment here. Let's give it one more minute and then we'll get started. While waiting, if you wanted to put your name and where you are tuning in from, that's always a fun thing to see on these webinars. If you'd like to say what county you're in, if you're in Michigan or perhaps in another state, that would be great.
How do you do that?
You can throw it right in the chat on the bottom of chat. You can type in your name and where you're from.
Click on an icon that looks like a speaking cloud or a word cloud from a cartoon. And then an area will pop up where you can type in.
All right, I'm gonna get my screen going here.
I don't know what you did. I was just listening to it.
Did you want, did they want to hear you?
Hi, folks. If you can make sure you're
we
muted,
can
that'd be
type
great.
in.
Did you miss it?
Can Ralph or Carol confirm that the screen?
Oh, unmuted. Okay.
The screen is up, Emily,
Perfect.
showing
All right.
Protecting Our Lakes and the beautiful sunrise or sunset and today's event.
Perfect.
I
All
think
right.
we're going to remind everybody about checking all our participants.
Yep.
About checking the mute.
Yep. So I'm going to go ahead and get started because I want to leave
wanna
most of our time to our
have some-
presenter here. But thank you everyone for joining us. My name is Emily Cook. I am the outreach specialist with the Invasive Species Network, which is a program within the Grand Traverse Conservation District. And we're serving as the host today, and we're really excited to have this presentation. A couple housekeeping things I wanted to mention is that we are recording this. And so it will be available next week, hopefully, up on the district's YouTube page if you wanted to view it again or share with some folks. Also, if you could please make sure you're muted. You can turn your cameras off if you prefer. You don't have to. The main thing though is to make sure that mute's on, so we aren't talking over anybody. And we're going to be taking questions at the very end. We've got a good crowd today, so if you have questions as they come up, feel free to put them in that chat box. And some others will be moderating that, and at the end we'll try and get to as many as we can. So really quickly, before we dive into the presentation, just for a moment, I'm going to talk a little bit about the Conservation District. As I said, we're the hosts for today, and the district was established 80 years ago. It's our 80th anniversary this year, actually, as a way to give farmers tools for better ways to do agriculture during the Dust Bowl era. And I'm going to keep letting some people in as they come here, so I apologize if I pause. But since then, over those 80 years, the district has really developed to encompass all different forms of conservation. So we're housed out of the Boardman River Nature Center. I'm assuming many of you have been there. This is right in Traverse City, Michigan. And it was built in 2008, and it's where our offices are, but it's also really the hub for environmental education in our region. And encouraging people to get outside. So I encourage you to stop if you get the opportunity to. There's many different programs within the districts. Like I mentioned, I work for the Invasive Species Network, and we're based out of the Conservation District, along with our regional forester, our MEP technicians, or the folks who go out and certify agriculture productions, farms, and of the lake to make sure they're abiding by certain environmental rules. And then we have our huge environmental education program and preschool program for kids as well, which is really great. There's a few ways you can get involved, or if you'd like to know more about the district, you can become a volunteer. Just being responsible outdoors and promoting that responsibility is a very big deal to us. We have a lot of events throughout the year. We encourage you to come and participate in those, or participate in our partner events like you are today. You can become a trail steward, letting us know if our trails are in shape or if they need certain attention. And then of course, donating is always helpful. We are very lucky to be funded by a millage through the county since 2018, but that doesn't fund all the programs. So donating is always a great way to support. And on that note, very breezy presentation on the district. Like I said, I want to Brian mostly. But if you want information or want to learn more, it's up there on the slide. On that, I will turn it over to Ralph here from Poles, and he will be introducing our speaker.
Great, thank you, Emily, and hello, everyone. My name is Ralph Bednars. I want to thank you all for participating in the third annual Protecting Our Inland Lakes and Shorelands series. Poles was started by the Friends of Spider Lake, Carol Kusel and Hetty Herzberger in 2019. I joined the Poles team last year after building our house on Rennie Lake and moving to the greater Traverse City area from Lansing, Michigan. We also partnered with Katie Gariziak in the Grand Traverse Conservation District to host the Poles series last year. We have been able to bring to the local lake communities some very knowledgeable and interesting speakers on various aspects of lake and lakeshore ecology, best management practices, and threats. We held Poles as a virtual event last year, and we are continuing the virtual format for the 2021 Poles Lunch and Learn series. Today, we have another very excellent speaker, Brian Majka. Brian is a restoration ecologist with GEI Consultants based out of Allendale, Michigan. He has worked for over 20 years with all aspects of ecological restoration, including the design and implementation of wetland, prairie, and forest areas. Brian specializes in the restoration of freshwater systems and has extensive experience in the use of natural systems for erosion control in streams and lakes. As a founding member of the Michigan Natural Shoreline Partnership, he helped develop a program to teach natural shoreline design and construction to contractors and designers throughout the state. Brian, welcome and thank you for kicking off the 2021 Poles series with Protecting Our Inland Lakes and Shorelands, Ice, Wind, and Waves. Brian, the virtual stage is yours.
Thank you, Ralph. I appreciate that. And I really do appreciate the opportunity to speak to everybody here today. So I'm going to share my screen here. Does everything look okay?
Looks good.
Good. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about water and waves and lakes. We could probably subtitle this presentation, Waves for Non-Engineers. What I'm going to talk a little bit about is how waves work, how they form, and how they interact with our shorelines. Really with the idea being it's important to understand waves and physical forces on our shorelines and in our lakes because they do have very realistic or very real ecological impacts on our shoreline. So we're going to talk a little bit about waves, where do waves come from, some of those characteristics, how do those waves actually interact with shorelines. And I'm also going to talk a little bit about lake mixing and how that actually occurs as a result of wind as well as some other properties. So When we start talking about waves and shorelines, we always try to start out with the idea of this term we like to use, the land-water interface. And the land-water interface is that narrow niche where the land and the water connect. And typically that's a very narrow width on our shorelines, but it's an incredibly important ecological niche because so many of our smaller fish species, amphibians, birds, mammals, they rely on this very narrow niche where the water meets the land during some part of their life cycles, whether it's reproduction, food, cover, water, all of these different types of factors. But the trouble with this land-water interface is that it's incredibly susceptible to these erosive forces. So it's a very delicate portion of our lakes, but it's also very critical, which is why we wind up spending a lot of time talking about it. So starting out, just kind of an introduction, what is a wave? So a wave is a swell in a body of water, typically with forward motion. Something to keep in mind is that a wave is not actually a transfer of matter. It's not a transfer of water. It's a transfer of actually energy. So if you think about sitting out in a lakeshore, if you're floating on a raft and waves come by, that wave is going to push you up and then you're going to go back down again. But most of the time, if you're on that raft, even though when that wave passes you, you sit still. That's because that energy is passing through the water, but it's not actually moving the water itself, the matter itself of the wave. So the way we can kind of think of this is wave is really just another form of solar energy, because what happens is the sunlight heats the earth and the sunlight heats water, and earth and water heat at different rates. So when you have this uneven heating of the Earth's surface, it creates wind. So the energy from the sun is transferred to the water, transferred to the land, and then that energy winds up in the form of wind. And that wind energy then is transferred back into our water, and I'm going to talk about that in just a minute, and creates waves. So really, when you think about it, waves are just another form of solar energy. So starting again with a few quick kind of definitions, which are important when we're talking about waves, we use this term fetch a lot. And the term fetch is the longest uninterrupted distance across the open water from a given site. So if you stand on your lake shoreline, or if you looked on Google Maps, the longest possible reach that you could make from your point, that's fetch. And that fetch is important because waves wind up being a function of fetch. And I'll talk about that a little bit more in just a minute. We talk a lot about wave run-up. And the wave run-up is maximum onshore elevation reached by a wave. So if you think about a wave, it's moving across a water body, it reaches a shoreline. That wave breaks and interacts with the shoreline. The run-up is going to be essentially that slope and how far that wave as it crests will reach up onto the shoreline. Bathymetry is essentially the elevation but below a water line. Then we use this term slope a lot, and slope is really important when we're talking about shorelines and waves. And we often describe shoreline as run over rise. So if we say a 5-to-1 slope, that's 5 vertical or 5 horizontal feet for every 1 foot of rise. So oftentimes we'll say a 5-to-1 slope, and that's what that refers to. So the smaller your number, a 2-to-1 slope would have 2 feet of run to 1 feet of rise. That's going to be a steeper slope. A 10-to-1 slope is going to have 10 feet of run for every 1 foot of rise. So that's going to be a gentler slope. So those are terms that we use a lot that are important when we're talking about waves and shorelines and how they interact. So when we start talking a little bit more about waves really come from 3 different places. Waves can be wind driven, and I touched on that a little bit, and we'll go into more depth about that. waves can be what we would call gravitational, which are essentially tides. We don't really have tides here in the Great Lakes, so we get some different forces acting. Some people will say that they have observed moon effects on specifically Great Lakes water levels, but for all intents and purposes, we really don't have tides here in the Great Lakes, or especially with our inland lakes themselves. We don't see that pronounced impact. But then we have disturbance-driven waves. And these can be anything from tsunamis to what we most commonly see on our inland lakes is boats, which create a disturbance in the water. Or, you know, if you think about jumping off a diving board into a pool, creating a cannonball, that you are creating disturbance-driven waves. But really, when we're dealing with our lakes, our inland lakes and lake management, we tend to be focused on boat-driven waves and wind-driven waves. So that's what I'm going to talk most about here. So how do waves actually form when they're driven by wind? So if you picture a very calm day, no wind at all, and then you start to see wind pick up just a little bit. Well, what happens is anytime two forces or two molecules pass each other, in this case, an air molecule and the water surface, there's friction. So as that air molecule starts to, in the form of wind, starts to move across that water surface, it starts to create what we call micro ripples. And that's because of that friction that's created between the wind and water. Well, as that wind blows for a longer duration or potentially starts to blow harder, what happens is those micro ripples create more friction. And then what happens is those micro ripples will turn into larger ripples, which will then turn into a chop, and then we'll start to turn into fully formed waves. So you get this kind of positive feedback loop that the stronger the wind blows, and the longer that it blows, it creates more and more friction across that wave surface. And then the larger that the waves get, then the bigger the waves can get because there's more and more friction associated with it. So this is what's happening when that energy, that solar energy in the form of wind at that point, gets transferred to the water. So the wind is basically taking all of that energy, transferring it into the water and starting to build these waves. So that wave height ultimately winds up being a factor of a function of depth, wind speed, wind duration, and then that fetch. How long is the water body that wind is blowing across? So we start to look at how the waves actually start to work as they're blowing and as they're interacting with the shoreline. And what's going to happen is these waves are going to start to build. Typically, you're going to see rolling waves offshore. And then at some point, as a wave gets closer to the shoreline, that wave is going to start to break. And you can see that kind of actively happening here in this video. So what happens is when the wave height reaches about 80% of the water depth, that wave is going to start to break. And then at that point, the wave force is going to interact with the shoreline in two different ways. You're going to have an orbital force, which is the force of that wave breaking up and over onto the shoreline. And then we're going to have the swash and back swash. And you can kind of see that happening on this photo here on the right side of those willows, that after the wave breaks, just lakeward of those willows, the water then moves back and forth. And both of those forces, both the orbital force and the swash and backswash or backwash, can create erosion and move soil. So then the other type of wave that we might typically get is what we think of as boat-driven waves. So boat-driven waves are disturbance-driven waves. And as I'm sure many of you have seen, the size and shape of the wave is very influenced by the size and shape and speed of the boat. One of the big problems that we're seeing these days is that you have boats like wake boats that are very intentionally designed to create larger waves. So what can happen in these situations, because boats are engineered this way, is that these wake boats, specifically when they're designed to create larger waves, they can push water And when they push water up, these boat-driven waves can actually create larger waves than wind-driven waves because of these physical properties that they have. One of the characteristics to kind of keep in mind when you're talking about boats, and you can see in this graph on the upper right-hand corner of the picture here, is that it's not an even shaped curve. So you don't necessarily have a situation where the faster the boat, the bigger the wave, because what happens is as a boat goes faster and faster and faster, the waves will get bigger. But then at some point that boat starts to plane on the water surface. And once that boat is planing instead of what we might call plowing water, the wave height's actually going to go down. So sometimes when we're looking at things like minimum setbacks, no wake zones, and things like that, understanding how boats are actually operated is really important, because oftentimes the highest wave heights don't necessarily come from a maximum speed. They come from that startup or slowdown period of a boat when it's plowing water a little bit more. So what happens with boat-driven waves as opposed to wind-driven waves is that we like to say that they're periodic and that or they're episodic, right? So you have boat-driven waves that are very intensely created while boats are being used, but then you'll have a calming period afterward when boats are not in action. Whereas with wind-driven waves, you could have potentially a 3-day storm with constant winds, and especially this spring we tend to see that a lot. And in those cases, you get just this constant shot over and over and over again. So understanding on your individual lake what the greater forces are they wind-driven waves because of the size and orientation of the lake from your site, or are they boat-driven waves because of how the lake is used, where your site might lie in the way of water ski lanes and things like that? These types of things become very important in understanding how these physical forces interact on your shoreline themselves. This is a video I took a few weeks ago. Actually, we were out on a boat, and this is just a little 14-foot, 16-foot flat bottom John boat. We're out on Lake Erie, and as you watch how these waves are created, you can see that they just look very different than those wind-driven waves that we saw in the previous video. That motor, and again, this is a small boat, small motor. You can see how that motor itself just pushes that water up, and you can imagine amplifying that to a 20 or 30-foot wake boat with a 200 horse motor on it and a hull that's very specifically designed to create waves. But even this, nevertheless, you can see how those waves start to interact with the shoreline itself. So going back again to some of these characteristics of waves and just kind of focusing on this and looking at the shoreline itself, and this principle that waves will start to break when the wave height reaches 80% of the water depth. What that really means is that the gentler your shoreline slope is, the further offshore your wave is going to break. Because with that shallower water, the wave's going to start to break offshore, and then you're not going to have necessarily that orbital force breaking right onto your shoreline itself. Whereas if you have a steeper slope, that wave isn't going to break until it gets right up on the shoreline. So we'll show that. I'll show a graphic in just a second again, and just how that works. So you have all of these different factors coming together that create waves. The water depth, the slope of the water, your site orientation. Do you have anything breaking up that wind direction across the shoreline itself? The fetch, adjacent structures, are there breakwaters, jetties, things like that present? Is there aquatic vegetation present? Because aquatic vegetation will actually dampen those wave effects. But what we see with all of these things considered, what it really comes down to is wave height, both wind and boat driven height, are often limited by that combination of the length of fetch and depth. So understanding both of those factors are very important. So here we're going to watch our little surfer dude starting out with a gentle slope. And you can see in these cases with a gentle shoreline, the wave breaks offshore, there's much less energy on the shoreline itself, and he's able to exit safely off the surfboard. As that run up starts to get steeper, that wave breaks much closer to the shoreline, and you wind up getting much more energy, much more erosive force on the shoreline itself. And then when we start to really get into a steep slope, that's where the wave doesn't even start to break until you get right onto the shoreline itself. All of that energy is released right on the shoreline instead of being broke off the shoreline. And in cases where you have that deeper water, those steeper slopes, those are the situations where you tend to get the most erosion on a shoreline itself. And here's just kind of a couple of examples of that. So the picture on the top left, that's Muskegon Lake. At this site, there was about a 4-mile fetch. That picture was taken during a storm that had 50 to 60 mile an hour winds. And in this particular case, you had a seawall out in front of these homes, and you had the deepest portion of the lake isn't too far away from this particular location. So what was happening here is these waves, as they were building, in this particular case, you had 6 to 8 foot waves building offshore. There was no opportunity for that energy to be dissipated until it hit that steel seawall itself. And what was happening in this case is that all of that energy was being released, an incredible amount of force, and then all of that energy was actually throwing aquatic vegetation onto rooftops of houses across the street from the seawall. That's how much energy was present because of that slope and that depth. Picture on the bottom right, that's Grand Haven State Park. Grand Haven's where I live. And one of the things I like to do is kind of geek out and go out during big wave events and just observe waves and watch how they're working. And this day this was a day that we had 25 foot waves measured out offshore off of Lake Michigan, which is usually about the highest waves that we see on Lake Michigan. We'll get that maybe once a year. We'll get those events that'll kick up 20 to 25 footers. Well, when you walk along the shoreline here, you can see, because there's such a long, wide, gentle slope, those waves are breaking out offshore. So what happens is, by the time that wave energy actually gets up onto the beach, that energy has been dissipated, and you just kind of get this gentle swash and backswash on the shoreline itself, because the waves are breaking 20 and 30 yards out offshore. So even though you have huge waves out there, what's actually the erosive forces interacting with the shoreline itself wind up being significantly dissipated. So this has a lot of design implications for us when we start to talk about designing different types of shoreline protection methods. So this is a graph that came from an Army Corps of Engineers book, some shoreline guidance that came along the way. On the bottom, you have wave height, and that's in feet. And then on the left, on the y-axis, that is a logarithmic scale, and that is the weight of a stone in pounds. And I've drawn a couple of different lines here to demonstrate a point, because what's mapped on here, you see these arcs of the degree of a slope. And the point to take away from this is that for the same shoreline, a 1.5 foot wave will move a 9-pound stone, while a 6-inch wave will move a 0.3 pound stone. But when you start to look at a 5-degree slope versus a 30-degree slope, a 1.5 wave will move a 1-pound stone on a 5-degree slope, but a 10-pound stone on a 30-degree slope. So when you think about the size of a rock, a 1-pound stone is only going to be about that big. 10-pound stone is going to be about that big. So when you're looking at what you need to do to protect your shoreline, the steeper the slope, the heavier the rock that you need to use. And this translates directly to natural shoreline engineering, because what that means is when we're trying to incorporate and use vegetation instead of rocks along shorelines, the gentler the slope that we have, the less rock or no rock we are able to use in stabilizing our shorelines. And when we're trying to really do use lake healthy and lake friendly shoreline protection, that's the name of the game. Is we want a gentle slope. We want that energy dissipated so we can use the softest and most lake friendly measures possible. So now that we understand waves and how waves interact with shorelines, well, how does that wave energy actually degrade the shorelines? Well, there's a few different things that wave energy does. One is just soil erosion. The physical forces that wave will move soil particles. Depending on the size of that soil particle, the wave energy, it'll physically move it. The other thing that the wave energy will do is it'll physically displace those plants. So depending on the types of plants that you have, those waves can actually just pick up those plants and move them. Now, a lot of our good native wetland shoreline species are able to resist a lot of that energy, but not necessarily all of it. But they can resist a lot more of that wave energy than, say, something like turf grass. So if you imagine turf grass has very short root systems, it just doesn't hold up well to wave energy at all. But a lot of our native bulrushes and grasses and things like that are going to have deep, extensive root systems, very thick roots and rhizomes, and they're going to be very strong and tough, and they're going to be able to resist that wave energy. One of the other things that waves will do is they'll create turbidity. And by constantly churning up sediments, especially if you have a lake that has more, say, clay instead of sand, where that clay tends to stay suspended. When you have a lake that has a lot of turbidity, you're going to get a lot less aquatic vegetation. And that aquatic vegetation is critical for fish habitat. Fish require that submerged aquatic native vegetation for cover, for food, to be able to hide from predators. That's really where they make their home. So the murkier the water is, less of that vegetation that you get. So another way that wave energy degrades shorelines, especially when humans get involved, is that waves, regardless of whether or not they are wind-driven or boat-driven, waves lead to more armoring of shorelines. So this came from a study, and what you can see in this graphic here is that regardless of waves, whether it's boating intensity or the fetch of the lake, the longer the fetch, the more the boating activity, the higher percentage of a shoreline that winds up being armored. And then what happens is, as people start to armor shoreline, these problems start to snowball themselves. Because if one person armors a shoreline, that deflects a lot of wave energy. That wave energy all has to go somewhere, goes onto your neighbor's property. Well, then your neighbor starts, or then that person's neighbor decides that they need to protect their shoreline. And then you wind up with these lakes that have entirely armored shorelines all the way around. So here's some graphics. These are put together by Tip of the Mitt Watershed Council up in Petoskey. They did a great job. Some of these graphics just really help to demonstrate how some of these waves and these physical forces really work when they're interacting with shorelines. Here you can see those waves physically displacing that sediment and actually causing erosion. Part of the trouble that we get into when we're using seawalls, and we talk about this kind of feedback loop that happens when we create these hardened shorelines, is going back to this idea that all of that energy in a wave has to go somewhere. Well, when we have a vertical seawall and all of that wave energy hits that seawall, where is that energy going to go? It's either going to go to the sides or it's going to start to go down. And when it goes down, like you see in this graphic here, it starts to scour out the sediment below that seawall. So what happens is you wind up getting deeper areas in front of these seawalls. So you get the aquatic vegetation displaced. As that water depth becomes deeper from that scour action, obviously, like we talked about earlier with the effective depth on waves, the deeper it gets, the higher that wave energy. So you get this so you start to get this feedback loop. And that's why oftentimes in front of seawalls, you see a total lack of aquatic vegetation. And that's just because all of that energy is just so great beneath the surface that vegetation just can't get established. And again, this idea of the impacts on people's neighbors. All that energy has to go somewhere. It goes down through scour or it goes sideways. And when that wave flanking gets transferred along that shoreline, it's very common that you'll see scour pockets on either side of a seawall, just like you see here. But one of our friends in this battle against waves and trying to protect our shorelines and do lake friendly things is aquatic plants. Aquatic plants not only provide habitat, but they actually buffer that wave energy. So anything that we can do to get aquatic vegetation established is only going to help the forces on our shorelines themselves. So how do we know that all of this kind of thing works? Well, when we start talking about natural shorelines, we take our cues from nature. These ideas of working with natural shorelines, lake-friendly shorelines, these aren't just things that we dreamt up in a box. Nature has created natural shorelines, and I took this picture off the tip of the Leelanau Peninsula, Leelanau State Park in the middle of Lake Michigan, big, high-energy system. Lo and behold, what do you have? A nice natural vegetated shoreline out there. So nature figured a lot of this out long before we came along. And if we can take clues from existing natural shorelines, especially in high energy systems, that's going to give us ideas of where we can apply and how we can apply natural shorelines to our impacted lake systems. So some common things that we see are 10-to-1 to 20-to-1 slopes. Oftentimes these systems are very dynamic and transient, so they don't stay necessarily locked down. These shorelines all kind of move a little bit, and that's okay. Sometimes as humans, we're wired to want to lock things in place, keep them from moving, but natural shorelines, they move back and forth. Vegetation moves back and forth. It's all part of the process. They're not always vegetated, but they often are. We usually see this kind of mosaic of shrubs and grasses and wildflowers, and they all kind of move back and forth. Again, the idea is by observing physical characteristics and vegetation along these shorelines, that gives us our template for understanding how to restore our shorelines. We kind of wrap up here a little bit talking about what we call dimictic lakes. And our lakes, considering our temperate climate here, are what we would call dimictic. And what these lakes are is our lakes stratify. And the reason for that is, if you look on this graphic on the right here, the colder water is, the more dense it will be. So what happens is colder water sinks to the bottom, warmer water stays at the top. So seasonally speaking, in the middle of the summer, when we have a lot of heat in the atmosphere, we'll get this warm upper layer, and we call that the epilimnion, as you can see in the graphic down here below. That's that warm upper zone. That tends to be a very, very productive zone of the lake. We have warm water, we have a lot of plankton, we have a lot of aquatic vegetation. We'll see a lot of fish feeding in that area, especially in the morning and in the evenings. And then most lakes will form what we call a thermocline. And a lot of you have probably seen this if you're swimming in a lake and you dive down a little bit too deep, or for you fishermen, you certainly know this. You go down through that warm upper layer, and then all of a sudden you'll say, wow, I just hit a cold spot. And that's typically where you're going, from that epilimnium to that thermocline. And that thermocline exists between the epilimnion and then when we get down into that hypolimnion. And when we get into that colder bottom zone, we tend to have less oxygen because colder water is going to hold less oxygen. And that zone of the lake is going to tend to be much less productive overall from a fish perspective. So you'll oftentimes see fish hanging out right around that thermocline because it's that cold water spot during the summer, but where you still have a lot of production in the way of plankton and algae and food for the fish themselves. So how does this wind interact with our lake itself? Well, if you think about a summer situation where things tend to be a little bit more stable, you have this upper warm layer, the wind's going to interact with the lakeshore, but because we have such stratification of the water itself, that epilimnion is going to tend to kind of mix itself, but you're not going to see a lot of turnover in the lake. But then what tends to happen in autumn and in spring is that upper layer of water starts to get cold. And going back to this idea that colder water is more dense, that upper layer of water gets cold, it starts to sink. And as that colder water starts to sink and the wind's moving, you start to get mixing, or what we call turnover of the lake itself, as that upper layer of water starts to mix with that lower layer of water, and you get what you can call a turnover of the lake. In the Great Lakes, that tends to be a fairly pronounced feature. In fact, you'll have multiple times, typically during the summer, where you'll see the Great Lakes turnover. And for those vacationers that come from out of town and try to swim in the Great Lakes, we see it all the time, where the lake temperature might be 70 degrees one day and 50 degrees the next, almost unswimmable. And that can happen even in the middle of July when you get these midsummer turnovers. But you don't tend to see that on our inland lakes as much, where lakes tend to stay a little bit more stable and stratified. So kind of wrapping things up, and then we'll have some time for some questions. Waves are typically going to originate from a couple of different places, but really on our inland lakes, we're focused on wind and disturbances such as boats. Understanding your fetch depth, wind speed, and wind duration, those are all really key factors in understanding the height of waves and how those waves are going to interact with the shoreline itself. Gentler slopes and vegetation, whenever possible, whenever you can incorporate those into a site, they're going to dampen and dissipate that wave energy. And when we're able to account for those factors, even in higher energy systems, that becomes our basis for being able to create softer and stable shorelines, such as the shorelines that you see in these pictures to the right. And when you're able to create those softer shorelines and restore that land-water interface, you're benefiting the overall ecology of the lake for all of the wildlife, the insects, the fish, the amphibians, the birds that depend on being able to move back and forth across that land-water interface in the near shore zone as their key habitat. So with that, I guess I will open things up to questions, and I understand that Ralph and Emily will be kind of moderating questions through the chat. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. Ralph's been doing a little bit of response to questions. So thanks, Ralph. And thank you, Brian, for a great presentation. There are some questions. We'll just kind of work our way up from the bottom. And Carol asked if extensive use of a bubbler on an inland lake during winter could lead to negative impact on water turnover.
So I would say yes. I would love to get Ralph's thoughts on this. We do see those bubblers used on lakes, and yes, they can add oxygen, which can limit algae or limit ice growth. The trouble is that when we talk about the importance of that epilimnion and that stratification for lake productivity, the trouble is that those bubblers can artificially create mixing, which can actually be harmful and detrimental to the overall lake ecosystem. Ralph, do you want to expand on that at all?
Yeah, sure. Bubblers certainly would have an impact on moving water, especially cold water, since it tends to be pretty similar in density. But it's going to be site specific. And from a whole lake's perspective, you'd need more of a massive aeration type system, kind of in the middle of the lake with lots of air being bubbled in to really affect the whole lake.
And I will say that there are some of those whole lake systems that have been installed throughout the state. And, you have to be very, very careful with the use of those because they can interrupt the ecological balance of the entire lake.
Thank you. We had another comment. It was more something to elaborate on. can you speak on creeks and small rivers that are running into a larger body of like a huge lake? So the creek has momentum and meets a big body of water with opposite momentum.
Sure. So what actually winds up happening, and this happens with both creeks and even larger lakes, is you tend to see actually a lot of the energy and flow of those creeks start to slow down and get dissipated as we get closer to a lake. And this happens at both a small scale and at a very large scale. If you think about what we might call our drowned river mouth lakes, up and down the Great Lakes coast, whether it's the Kalamazoo River, Muskegon River, Grand River, the Paramarquette, all the way up and down. Most of those creeks and rivers will actually have higher energy when they are further away from the lake system, because as hydraulically speaking, that the lake will control the flow of that lake and river when it comes close to it. So essentially all that water has to go somewhere. Imagine your creek coming down this way, runs into this lake. This lake says, nah, I'm going to slow you down a little bit. And you see what we call a backwater effect that can be pronounced, sometimes even miles upstream from especially a larger lake, from those lake, a backwater effect on the flows and forces of those rivers and streams. So you don't tend to see the rivers and streams having necessarily a negative impact on the lakes themselves, although that can happen in select cases here and there. But instead, it's more of a factor that the lake itself has an impact on slowing down the energy of those creeks and streams.
All right, we have one more, but in the meantime, if there are any other questions, folks can throw them in the chat. Rolf spoke to this one a little bit, but I'll throw it to you too. It's a question regarding the Natural Shoreline Professionals program. And basically there's many property owners and landscapers that she's familiar with that are ready to basically do the right thing and do natural shoreline work. But because the next round of trainings aren't available until 2022, are there any resources or is there anything that can be done in the meantime to get folks educated or on board with kind of the process for doing those shoreline work?
Sure. So I definitely recommend that everybody go to the Michigan Natural Shoreline Partnership website. And there's a lot of resources and information available on that website related specifically to the use of natural shorelines, some different techniques and things like that. I also suggest there's a website developed out of the University of Connecticut called the Living Shoreline Academy. And until we get a chance to get the Michigan Natural Shoreline Partnership Training Program up again, the Living Shoreline Academy actually has a free online self-tutorial that you can step through that teaches you about the use of natural and living shoreline. So I think that's a great resource combined with information that's available on the Michigan Natural Shoreline Partnership. Those are both great places to help you kind of with self-study and self-learn some of these things until we're able to get the Shoreline Partnership training program up again, which we are planning on having available come 2022.
Perfect. We did have another question come through. It's on my inland lake, owners mostly use rock jetties to abate wave action erosion. Comments on using rocks and their position out into the lake or along the lake shore.
I'm sorry, could you repeat that real quick? I was trying to answer.
Let me try to rephrase it. Basically, on this person's inland lake, owners are using mostly rock jetties to abate wave action and erosion. What are your thoughts on using those large rocks to prevent that wave action along the shoreline? And does their position and how they're placed in the lake affect the lake shore?
So the state of Michigan is not a fan, and honestly, most state and federal agencies are not a fan of the use of groins and jetties and offshore structures anymore. because one of the things that I did not touch on is what we call littoral drift. And there is a natural drift of sediment along a lake shore, and all lakes will have this. Sediment, sand will naturally move its way around a lake shore in different directions. And what happens is when you put these types of rock structures jutting out into the lakeshore, what'll happen is you might protect your shoreline or get some natural aggradation of sediment on one side of that groin or jetty or that rock structure, but you're going to starve sediment from the opposite shoreline. And when you interrupt that natural transport and that natural sediment transport, you might be solving your problem, but you're making the problem worse for the person downstream or the person next door. So that's why state and federal agencies really do not like the use of those structures anymore. A lot of those were put back in you know, the 1960s and 1970s and things like that. But you know, all they do is transfer the problem downstream.
And that's all the questions I'm seeing come through.
Yeah, Brian, before we let you go, one more question from me. I know you didn't have a chance to really talk about ice and the impacts of ice, but could you briefly mention ice push and what are some of the best shoreline practices that can be implemented to help protect against ice push?
Sure. So, you know, especially those of you that have properties on northern lakes, you've certainly experienced ice bush. You know, people in the UP and Minnesota and Wisconsin have seen places where whole structures have been moved from ice push. And what happens is ice can interact with the shoreline in a couple of different ways. One being during the winter, you get, once ice is formed, when you get a freeze thaw cycle, that ice will contract and it'll push out and it'll cause ice ridges. You also get ice when it breaks up in the spring. You'll get ice actually, you know, ice drifts actually essentially bashing into shorelines themselves. So the things that you can do to typically try to address that are two different things. One is, again, going back to shoreline slope. The gentler slope that you have, the more that ice is going to ride up and down along the shoreline. Whereas when you have a steeper slope, that ice is very, very strong in compression. When you have a steeper slope, that ice is going to tend to gouge it. But with a gentler slope, that ice is going to ride up and down. So you can create a gentler slope. And then one of the other things that we try to do is roughen the slope. So if you think about an ice or ice sheet, ice tends to not grow or be weakened when you have a rougher surface. So when ice is intact and very strong, it's got a lot of strength. When it's broken, it has a lot less strength. So whether it's in a super high energy shoreline using scattered boulders in order to roughen the shoreline, or scattered rock instead of continuous rock to roughen the shoreline, that can make that ice weaker. You can also use natural structures such as logs and wood and things like that to actually roughen the surface and use essentially the strength of that ice against itself to force it to break, as opposed to trying to fight against it. So that's the brief ice summary there.
Great, thanks, Brian.
Right, so that was all the questions I'm seeing. And on that note, I think I will conclude, and just wanted to really thank Brian again for speaking today. His contact information is there on the screen, and he did say previously that you're welcome to reach out to him with any questions that might come up. Like this is recorded. This presentation has been recording, and so we will get this up on the Grand Traverse Conservation District's YouTube page next week, the week after at the very latest, but we're aiming for next week. And I'm going to reshare my screen really quick here. If I can get the right one. And let's see. I did want to share the next polls presentation. Hopefully you can all see that on the screen. But this is the one coming up in June, next month, which seems really early, but it is the end of June, June 24th there. And registration is now available for that online as well at natureiscalling.org/events. So I will leave that up there. And I don't know if Ralph wanted to conclude or Carol, but thank you all for joining us today.
Yeah, Carol, you're muted.
And thank you again, everyone, for inviting me.
Carol, you're muted.
Hello.
There you go.
All right, sorry about that. I do have closing remarks and a few thank yous. Some of it Emily already covered very well. So if I repeat, please bear with me here. Thank you, Brian and Emily. What a great job. I feel the rest of us are pretty lucky that that we just got to sit back and lunch and learn when you two did all the work. Speaking of learning, boy, that presentation, Brian, was jammed with a lot of information. I like to think at the end of a webinar or class, gosh, what's my big aha moment from the interaction or the lesson? And what are my personal takeaways? In this one, the aha came at the very beginning. It's very simple, but never thought about it before. Brian said the wave energy is another form of solar energy. I think that's really interesting to think about and to take away from here. We certainly learned a lot of new terminology. I, for one, will be going back to the recording to be able to study that terminology and the graphs in more detail to really understand the bottom line of, again, what Brian started with is that land and water interface is such a critical part on our water systems. It's important for the habitat niche, and with the wave actions, whether they be wind driven, gravitational, or disturbance driven, they're really susceptible to erosion and habitat damage. I love all the resources that Brian shared with us to go and find out more about how we can protect our shorelands. I could go on, but I urge you to think about your personal takeaways from this short lunch and learn time we've shared today. As you enter the weekend and soon the unofficial start of summer over the Memorial Day weekend, take a few minutes and ponder your water spot, your favorite water spot, be it lake or stream. Think about the impacts of ice over the past winter and wind and waves in the warmer seasons. Think about what you can do to protect the water and its shores. And think about sharing what you've learned today with others. As Emily pointed out, the recording or this webinar was recorded and available on the Grand Traverse Conservation District's YouTube site. And as she pointed out, it'll be sent to your email. Go ahead, share that link with your fellow riparians and other people who recreate on your favorite water spot. Also, if you would, please go ahead and register for the next polls, Lunch and Learn. As Emily pointed out, it's coming up on June 24th, same time, 12 to 1:15. This time or that time, it'll be about algae and all its natural helpful states and, well, what happens when there's a little too much. While you're at the Grand Traverse Conservation District website, consider making a donation to them and to the Invasive Species Network. That's where Emily works. And thank them for hosting our Pole series, our Protecting Our Lakes and Shorelands. We're a small grassroots group of riparians who's interested in learning about our lakes and sharing that learning process. And we obviously couldn't do that without our presenters and our moderators, our hosts, and their generous gift of time and talent. So back to the thank yous. My fellow polls organizers, Ralph Bednars, who you met earlier today or earlier, and Patty Herzberger. Want to thank Brian and Emily once again. We will be sending them a selection of greeting cards with gorgeous scenes of inland Michigan lakes, complete with waves, not or naturally driven or wind driven, and details of all kinds of native plants on the shoreland. The artwork is by a Glen Arbor, Michigan artisan or artist, Kristen Herlin. So to close, let's raise our water glasses together and toast. Here's to our shared water and land stewardship. Let's go spread positive ripples. Thanks everyone for attending. Hope to see you on June 24th. Bye for now.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Brian. Thank you all.
Take care.